Welcome everybody to another mini lecture. Today we're going to be discussing the use of language in logic, science, philosophy, communication. I promise by the end of this video you'll have an understanding of the use of logic, how important it is as a foundation, why you should study it and look at it diligently when you are assessing things that are scientific, philosophical, or just looking for the truth in general. Language is absolutely fundamental and paramount. So of course, language is the foundation in which logic, epistemology, science, philosophy are all built upon. Language is a tool. That is very important. Mastery of this tool will lead to greater results on everything built upon this foundation. So mastery of the use of language will lead to better logic, to reasoning, better science, better epistemology, understanding of this reality, will lead to better philosophical debates, discourses, dialectics, rhetoric, etc. Communication. We are a community. We are social beings. There's no doubting this. All of our accomplishments come from we the people, together. Not one person has ever accomplished anything. It has always been groups of people. To be able to communicate properly, person to person, of course, is very important. To be able to share anything, value, we need to be conveying what we're speaking of properly. If you're speaking of the materialistic world, words should align with that. If we're speaking in abstract terms, they should still have proper meaning. And again, another self-evident, obvious statement is that without language, there is no philosophy, there is no science, there is no reasoning, whether it be induction or deduction. There is no empiricism without language. Right? There is no empiricism without reason and induction, without the rational mind. Okay, and the most boring part of learning language, something I absolutely hated in school. Actually went to a French school, and so my grammar and English already started out poorly, and I've had to work backwards and try and rebuild from the foundation up. But nobody likes learning about grammar. I'll dedicate another video, goes in depth into grammar, not necessarily teaching you what you were taught in school. We're going to look at the more important parts of grammar, more so the philosophy of it, and maybe go into more of the concrete things that you learned in school a little bit, but I'll keep it short here. We're going to look at it briefly just as a basis. This is the basis of language. So of course we have phonetics, the study of sound, and this is of course the basis of speaking. And so understanding how to pronunciate words properly, but really we're looking at the basics here, right? So we also have, and orthography is the study of written words. And orthography, of course, is the study of spelling, of course, foundational to writing. The reason I bring these two up is because if we go to the root of it, if we look upstream all the way, you get here. Logic, reasoning, science, philosophy, anything, any form of communication, whether it be selling, rhetoric, it does not matter. All comes down to this. If you're speaking and people can't understand you, then there's a whole breakdown in whatever is built on top of it. If you are writing and you cannot spell, you can make mistakes, that's fine. I make mistakes all the time. But you need to be generally able to spell, and this is where we see really a huge problem with the younger generations, with this spell check all the time. And it's creeping into the older generations too. We're all on technology. We don't need to know how to spell anymore. If nobody knows how to spell, they don't know how to write. What's that going to do to the logic? What's that going to do to the rhetoric? What's that going to do to our communication? We become so reliant on these things. And even beyond this, not to go off topic too much, but even with logic, the art of thinking. Now we just look everything up and we look at ChatGPT and AI to think for us, or we look for an authority or an expert. We have a breakdown, right? It's all reliant on external factors. We need to rely on ourselves and get back to the basics, the most boring things that you can learn about. I hated this in school, but it is so important. It's unbelievable. And so of course, with speaking and writing, we can build on top of this. It leads to rhetoric, the art of communication. We're trying to communicate things properly. This comes down in orthography here. We're talking also about actually writing out the words. I'll admit, I get lazy with my E's or whatever, the D's. You can't understand these symbols, right? Maybe a little bit, especially if it's in the greater context of different words. But you can get lazy with spelling, and that's a problem too, right? A lost art is calligraphy, right? Is cursive writing. A lost art. What's that going to do to everything built upon this? So this also has to do with logic. Rhetoric as well. Because logic essentially is the art of thinking, and fundamental to logic is argumentation. The fundamental to philosophy, that is the ultimate starting point of philosophy, is argumentation. And to be able to communicate your point properly, right, with rhetoric, the art of communication, you need to be able to look at meanings of words and look at, convey what you're saying properly. I think I've harped on this enough. It's very, very important to understand that a breakdown in the use of language can lead to illogical terms. If the grammar in the language is not there, the logic breaks down, the rhetoric breaks down, everything breaks down, right? It's so foundational, it's so important. And so this is what we need to keep in mind, right? Especially when we're teaching our kids. It's very important that they stay off technology, especially when they're very young. Now, I agree technology is an absolute advantage and using it as a tool is very important. I don't think kids before grade 10 should have any access to technology. There's no need. There is a need to introduce it. There is a need for them to learn it eventually, to give them the same advantage as everyone else, right? To have use of technology is very important in this day and age. We live in this modern society. But teaching them the basics, this is going to be the real weapon moving forward. I promise you that. And if you're losing this, you better start working on it. Okay, so there is two types of language. There's psychologically appealing language and there's logical language. Of course, here we're going to focus on the logical aspect of language. Not that the psychological component isn't important. It's especially important in rhetoric, where you're trying to appeal to people's emotions. It's absolutely important in art and literature and storytelling and life in general. The psychological connotations, meanings to a word, using different language to appeal to somebody is very important. It's a very important skill. It should be considered largely. However, for the purpose of this playlist, we're looking at thinking, logic, right? So we are going to look at the logical component of language rather than the psychological component, because in a dialectic, in logic, in the search for truth, you need not be concerned with emotion. Volitions, emotion, intentions, it does not matter. The truth is not concerned with who speaks of it. It doesn't matter. All that matters is the truth. The truth is the truth. Nothing else matters. And so in the pursuit of truth, we look at logical language. We omit all emotion. And in brief, considering logical language, we're looking at the dimensions of the word. We are looking at the meaning of the word. That is the most fundamental thing. Definitions are very important in science, in philosophy, in these fields. That is so important. There should be no emotive use of anything to convey a message or convince the audience, convince the population of something. However, this is used far too often in science. Science is less concerned with the truth than it is making a dollar. And that is fundamental in the problems in science. But I digress. Let's move back into the topic at hand here. The form of language is meaning. Cannot stress that enough. The meaning of a word. That is the basis of language. Semantics is the study of meaning. We're looking at the meaning of words, phrases, paragraphs, how they work together, separately, but not the context. Pragmatics is the study of context, concerned with a much different interpretation of the meaning of words. Within pragmatics, we're looking beyond the literal meaning of the word, how it's used in everyday life. So again, a very important study, but not concerned with the search for truth, not concerned with science. When you're in a discussion, in a dialectic, in a logical argument, there should be no appeal to the context. The context in which you're saying this is changing the meaning of the words being used, that should all be omitted. The words you use need to convey the meaning clearly, accurately, precisely. And so in the pursuit for truth, we are more concerned with semantics. We are more concerned with the study of the meaning of words. So with etymology, we're concerned with the origin and the history of the word, how the word changes over time. Almost a branch of semantics, how the meaning of the word changes over time. So within the study of etymology, you're also looking at the connections to other words and other languages as well. And so it can be very helpful. It's not necessarily going to be the crux of the meaning of the word. It's very important to understand. But when we're looking at the meaning of the word, you need to look at the semantics, right? This will give us a great lesson on how that word developed to be what it is. And again, important. You need to look at the development of the word, why it came to be, perhaps to understand the meaning of that word better. So we are looking at the changing semantics of the word, right? We're looking at the changes throughout history. And so it is very, very important to consider this. Now, it may not be the most logical to draw conclusions from this. However, it can give us a lot of insight and deeper meaning into why the words mean they do now. And often, tracking this history too can give us a more true meaning of the word as well. If, say, a word develops over time and is attributed to something that really has no proof, well, what you're looking at is the use of that word is likely the older meaning, right? So let's take virus, for example. Virus used to mean in Latin slimy liquid poison. Now it means a self-replicating contagion particle, right? You know, obviously viruses have never been proven to exist. Now, you can go read about that in the blog post that I made. But now people are questioning, well, what causes these illness? Let's look at the etymology of the word. It's a poison. And so that's important to understand as well. This can give us lots of great insight. Okay, words are symbols. Very important. Word is a symbol that's supposed to represent something in reality. Now, it doesn't necessarily represent that which is physical. It can represent things in an abstract way. But essentially, words convey individuals or essences. Individuals do pertain to this material existence. An individual is myself. I am an individual. Socrates was Socrates. My cat specifically, Simba, is an individual. My coffee table, specifically my coffee table with all of its details and its stains and its bumps and its bruises and its history and its legs and its height and its width, is an individual. Essence is what makes a being what it is. It is what distinguishes, characterizes, and groups together individuals into genus or species. Socrates was a man. Simba is a cat. My specific coffee table that is in the room right in front of me here is a coffee table. And it is a table as well. And it is a piece of furniture. And so the coffee table would be a species and the genus would be table. That's an example of breaking down species versus genus. Essence is what makes an individual what it is. Species are just classes of individuals that have the same specific essences. The genus is just a wider class of two or more species aggregated together. And an aggregate is two or more individuals grouped together. And so the teenagers in the neighborhood are an aggregate of individuals that they represent a specific class of individuals. I'm not talking about all the men in the neighborhood. I'm not talking about all the people. I'm not talking about the infants. I'm not talking about all the cats and dogs. I'm talking about the human being teenagers who are wreaking havoc in the neighborhood. Let's break down a few more terms. So a percept is a mental representation of a sensory experience. It's what you see, what you hear, what you smell. It's what you experience, what you feel. When I observe this piece of chalk, the percept is what I'm looking at here, or a lamp, or whatever it may be. And so a phantasm is a vivid image in your mind, but it's not based on the external reality. It's based on your imagination. It's based on the internal senses. And you can imagine anything. It doesn't necessarily mean that it's real. So examples in this include unicorns. Everyone can imagine a unicorn. Viruses also fall in this category. Even something like the structure of the atom is a phantasm. You cannot empirically observe through the senses an atom. And so a concept, something we'll be discussing in length moving forward, is an abstract categorization or classification of ideas, of objects, of experiences. It's important to note that this is an abstract mental representation. And so now we're getting into the topics of genus versus species. How are we classifying? How are we differentiating these phenomena? And so what we're doing is that we're grouping things together based on their essence. The concept of a dog includes many individual dogs, of course, but also includes many different breeds of dogs. Dogs are mammals, they have fur, they bark, they're domesticated animals. And so that last part of the concept of a dog actually excludes that of a wolf or a coyote, even though they share many other similarities. And so understanding the concept and what is in and what is out is very important. And this is when it comes to definitions, what we're trying to do is give a distinct set of essences to these symbols, to these words. We're trying to convey concepts properly. It's very important to note that concepts are not arbitrary. Good concepts represent real-world phenomenon properly, truthfully. And so that's very important to understand. These are not arbitrary definitions. They are representative of real ideas, experiences, objects, etc. Okay, of course here we have a very obvious relationship at this point that we understand very well. Of course, logic is the study of reasoning and inference. It is the art of thinking. Of course, we're looking at the validity and soundness of arguments in this case. We can understand two things. Words matter a lot in the study of logic, and that logic is important for any profession that you're in, so long as you're concerned with the truth. Of course, within logic, it relies heavily on the use of language to communicate argumentation, conclusions, premises, etc. The systematic approach to logic, whether it be induction or deduction, relies on reasoning, relies on verbal reasoning, right? It relies on language. And of course, by following the logical principles, we can look at language used in sentences, assess the validity of the meaning of these words, whether they represent in reality what is being conveyed by a word. We can assess the validity and soundness of the argument, the sentence as a whole. What does the sentence what is it conveying as a whole, right? So that we're looking at the study of semantics as a basic of looking at a sentence logically. Whether it's truthful or not, we need to understand the meaning of the words. And logic is concerned with the intellect, with the operations of the intellect, with the rational mind, with cognition. It is not concerned with emotions or volitions. We are truly concerned with thinking here, thinking clearly, undisturbed by any sort of external influence. Does not matter. The speaker does not matter. The circumstance matters only the essence of the argument, the validity of the sentences being used. And so in brief, the structure of logic requires language to convey the premises, the conclusions, the relationships, whatever it may be. Basis on language. And argumentation is the fundamental starting point of philosophy, of all knowledge inquisition. Argumentation, of course, relies on communication, which is language. Once again, it's very obvious to see all of the connections being made. This is a very self-evident lecture, but for some reason it needs to be said. Okay, and so within logical statements, we need to understand the meanings of each word. Again, this is absolutely paramount. This is where semantics comes into play. Understanding the meaning of each word separately, together in the sentence, what the sentence means, is very important, right? If we're thinking logically about something, it's very important that the language lines up with reality. Let's take Koch's postulates, for example. We have a set of 4 postulates to determine the causal relationship between a microbe, and a disease. The logic in Koch's postulates, of course, line up beautifully. The logic is there. It makes a lot of sense. The breakdown comes with the language. The breakdown comes largely with the word isolation, and this is for two reasons. First reason being that the term isolation that's used in the logical statements being made by Robert Koch and even Rivers later down the road does not refer to what is done in practice. So the word isolation does not align with what is done in an experiment. The other major problem, of course, is that isolation aligns with that of the scientific method. So the logic of Koch's postulates aligns with that of the scientific method. However, in reality, it does not represent reality. The words are used arbitrarily, ambiguously. They mean very little compared to what the words should mean. There has never been a purity achieved in those studies. And so we can see that evaluating each word is very, very important in this, because we need to assess the word isolate within these statements to understand whether the causal inference that's being made is a true one. Ambiguous language can be used to make something sound logical when in reality the words do not align, as we see in Koch's postulates. But ambiguous language can also break down logic as well. If you're assessing the meaning of a word and there is no true meaning assigned to that, and there's no real evidence of that word conveying any meaning in reality, then we see another breakdown within the logic, right? So ambiguous language should be completely omitted, of course, because ambiguous language leads to a breakdown in logic, in reasoning, and thus anything built upon that reasoning, of course, breaks down as well. Of course, the connection between language and science, of course, is obvious once again, because the scientific method is largely concerned with inductive reasoning, unless we're taking a pure Popperian stance through falsification, which does not occur in the scientific literature. It's largely induction-based. That is a less valid form of logical inference, of course. Regardless, you can use it logically, but language, again, plays a central role in any inference, in any logical reasoning. So science is based on reasoning, even if it is empirical. We're looking at empirical observations, trying to gather conclusions, causal relationships, etc. from that by validating or invalidating hypotheses. But we need to convey the hypothesis correctly, first of all. We need to ensure that all the words within a hypothesis are being conveyed properly in relation to reality. And so there's many ways that you need to go in and assess logically these scientific statements, because we're looking at the reasoning done in induction here. What you'll often see here now is the breakdown in empiricism, right? Because then you need to also understand the observation and was it done objectively. That we'll save for another YouTube lecture. And so language is used in many steps of science, of course. Creation of a hypothesis, the generation of a theory through induction, conclusions obviously have verbal connotations to them, communication in science, if science is discovering things but it's not communicated to the public in a truthful manner, objectively, then nobody benefits and then there's really no point to it. Iteration as well, we need to ensure that the methods in the experiments are conveyed properly, right? That the words being used and the methods is aligning with what's being done in the experiment, and so proper alignment there with the methods and reality is very important as well. Same with the results and reality. Are the observations objective, etc.? Are we using objective terminology? Remember, there's no room for volition or emotion whatsoever in reason, in logic. And so let's take an example of a hypothesis, the if-then statements. If it rains, then the ground will be wet. Well, first of all, we need to observe this statement, the words therein. What does wet, ground, rain, etc. mean? If I say rain and you think that I'm referring to hail, then there's a breakdown in communication. There's a breakdown in the language being used. Of course, there is a communal aspect to the language being used. There is a necessity for collective language, collective understanding, collective meanings, which is why we have things like dictionaries to standardize meanings of words. But then comes testing that statement. How are you going to test it? Are you going to test that in a laboratory? How would you even go about testing that hypothesis in a laboratory, right? So you need to understand that what's being communicated matters, right? The words in science matters, the words in papers matter. So you could go through and look at the meaning of the words. Do the meanings of the words actually align with what's done in reality? Do the models align with what's done in reality in a more symbolic form, I suppose? And so the development of language in science has been a great one. Within the last 100 years, we have so many novel terms being used in science. It's really important to go and look at these terms being used. In genetics, we have all of these terminologies. Is there true evidence that the words being used convey any sort of meaning in reality? Right? When we talk about genetics or nucleotides or whatever it may be, is there truthfulness to these statements? Is there a reality behind the words and the concepts being conveyed? And so the interplay between language and logic and science is obvious, to say the least, especially at this point. The problem is I felt compelled to make this lecture because I feel like there's been a breakdown in science, especially. I think words in science are used ambiguously, they're used very loosely, and this is very problematic because although science relies on induction, which I don't believe is as strong as deduction, it still requires reason and logic. And so it's very, very important that we understand the fundamental components of science, the language of science, which is so loose, it's so problematic. And we really need to assess it properly. When reading a paper, you could spend lots and lots of time assessing the words in the paper, ensuring that the words that they're being used aren't being used ambiguously, which happens far too often. And so I hope you enjoyed that lecture. Just remember, we're giving away a book at 1,000 subscribers, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions by Thomas Kuhn. It's a great read, very, very important, especially if you're into science, understanding the structure of how science moves forward in reality. Very great book. Stick around, subscribe, like, comment, share. Great way to support us. There's extra links down below if you want to go further. Of course, if you found this insightful and informative in any way, please help us out. Make sure that if you subscribe and your subscribers aren't public and you want to enter the giveaway, message me on Instagram, a little screenshot showing me that you follow. Be greatly appreciated so you can enter the contest in winning that book. Alright guys, I really hope you guys learned something today, and take care.